Hello, everyone, and welcome to Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their advice. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. In the 8+ years of Autism Personal Coach, I've had the opportunity to coach lots of adults, and I think especially in the last few years, there's been a growing number of people we've supported over the age of 50. That's definitely made me want to learn more about the experiences and supports that are out there for older autistic adults. That's why I'm so happy today to have a conversation with Eric Endlich, who is the author of the book Older Autistic Adults, in Their Own Words, The Lost Generation. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Eric, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Wanted to start off and learn, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Sure. Well, it's two events, really. Sometimes something happens to you that changes your future forever, and sometimes an event can change your past, and I've experienced both. The first one was in 1995, when my son was 1999, my son was 2.5 years old, and after evaluation, pediatric neurologist that my wife and I were seeing looked at us and said, "Your son has autistic disorder." And in an instant, everything changed. And it was one of the few moments in my life when I knew right at that moment, my life just changed forever. And it did. And it threw us into the world of autism and early intervention, special education, and so on. And that really dominated our life for quite some time. And then 15 or 16 years later, we were sitting at an autism conference, my wife and I, and we were listening to the keynote speaker, Sarah Hendricks, who's very entertaining and articulate. And after working working in the autism field for years, writing books and helping clients, even getting a master's in autism studies, she discovered in her 40s that she herself was on the spectrum too. And as we listened to this, it was like, hold on a second, a professional working in the field who's on the spectrum. And at that moment, my wife and I both realized that there was someone else in the family besides our son who was autistic, that namely me. And so ever since then, it's completely changed my life, changed my professional direction. I focus now, I sort of let my autistic special interests take over, and one of them is actually autism. So, I co-wrote this book on autism, and another one is college. And so I work with autistic students, helping them apply to college. That's the short version.
For me, one area that I want to learn more about in terms of the autistic experience is the experience of older autistic adults. And
Sure.
and in terms of that, you are one of the three authors of
Yes.
older autistic adults, in their own words, The Lost Generation. So just wanted to start out and learn, where did the idea to write such a book come about?
Sure. So I was the second person who signed on. It wasn't my idea. It was the first authors, that's Wilma Wake. And the three of us are all older autistic adults. And she had read a couple of books by Philip Wiley, one of them, Very Late Diagnosis of Asperger's Syndrome, another one, The 9 Degrees of Autism, which is kind of describes the stages of adjusting to autism diagnosis that people go through. And she was kind of curious, like, does this model of change, of development, really apply to, it's just a kind of a theoretical model. Does it really apply in the real world to autistic adults? And was curious, what is the experience of other autistic adults around the world? So she created, with Philip Wiley, this long survey, over 120 questions, and started administering it to adults, or letting them self take the survey. And then I signed on to the project. Wilma and I met at a group for mental health providers on the spectrum. I'm a clinical psychologist. And I was excited about the book, and we talked about it, and she wanted me to help out, and I helped get the survey widely distributed throughout the US and the UK especially, which is where most of our respondents are from. And then we wrote the book together, and we brought in Rob Lagos, who really helped a lot with the statistics.
Now, I think probably at this point, the majority of people that I've interviewed here on Autism Stories were diagnosed as adults. So I'm interested, was there a pattern that kind of emerged in terms of the experience of being assessed as autistic from those that you ended up interviewing?
Definitely, yeah, lots of patterns, which we describe in the book in great detail. And the book is a combination of individual stories, personal accounts, as well as kind of summaries of the group of 150 adults that we surveyed and interviewed. And so, a couple of patterns. One is virtually, this is again adults over 50 on the spectrum. Virtually everyone was diagnosed late. In most cases, I think after age 40. I kind of laugh when someone says, "Oh, my child was diagnosed late at 16," because virtually all of us were diagnosed quite a bit later in life, and that's because autism wasn't really known about when we were growing up, especially the subset of people on the spectrum with average to above average intelligence. Yeah, so one of the patterns is we were diagnosed late. Another is that women had more trouble getting diagnosed, and I know this from personal experience too, talking with lots of older women on the spectrum. And so, although most folks in the group were diagnosed by professionals, more than 3/4, among women, more of them, relatively speaking, they were more likely to have been self-diagnosed or self-identified than the men were. So that was a couple of patterns.
Was there a general feeling about how life changed for people after they were diagnosed, whether it was self-diagnosed or through medical diagnosis?
Yeah, definitely. And fortunately, it's mostly good news, and we do document this in detail. What are the changes that folks went through? In fact, a couple of the questions we asked were, when you were diagnosed, what did you feel? And with multiple choice answers. And then in the year after diagnosis, how did your life change? And then also, asking people kind of how they feel about autism at this point in their lives. And the most common reaction by far that people had after diagnosis was relief, and excitement was another one, but relief stood out by far as being the most common reaction. And then the most common reactions over the next year were, feeling better about themselves, people feeling better about themselves, feeling more positive about autism. So accepting themselves, feeling like they finally understood themselves, lots of positive changes. But, that being said, I kind of saw the group as being split into two groups, roughly. The vast majority, as I described, feeling relieved, feeling better about themselves, and then a small portion kind of getting stuck in that process of adjusting to the diagnosis. So whereas many of us kind of, whatever shock we might have felt at first, accepted it and incorporated it in a positive way, some people seem to get kind of stuck and bitter and negative and never kind of come to a peace with it and feel just, very negatively about their relationships and their life experiences. So all of us had challenges growing up, but most of us felt better after diagnosis.
The people you interviewed in the book grew up in a time that there were not a lot of support groups and there weren't much school-based interventions. We've heard for the longest time how important early intervention is. How did the people that you interviewed feel in regards to how not having these supports affected their childhood?
Yeah, great question. Well, I would say there was a handful of people who saw it as a good thing. A very small number of people who made comments along the lines of, I think it was good that I was in a regular classroom and I wasn't segregated, and it sort of taught me to adjust to, the mainstream world and so on. I would say a much more common reaction was feeling kind of sad that services weren't available back then, that most of us were bullied. Virtually none of us got any special services or programs or assistance, and people weren't understood as children. So they were, again, bullied, just sort of forced to try to fit in, deal with things that they may have been very uncomfortable with, like being on sports teams or trying to engage in group activities, speaking in class, whatever it might be. Lots of things that were very challenging. For the most part, people felt like, oh, if only I knew about this about myself younger, if only there was, help and understanding and support younger, life would have been so much easier growing up. That being said, people did feel like, at this point in their lives, they had adjusted and gotten to a much better place.
Talking about those, the people you interviewed, over the age of 50, did you get a sense from them that if their lives have improved, or are they happier?
Yes, absolutely. And we actually look at this in some detail, what changes people had after age 50. So, just to step back for a second, again, I'm a psychologist, so I have some awareness of kind of the literature at large. And in general, people tend to have more life satisfaction in midlife. It's a little bit different from what the stereotype might be. People think, oh, your best time in your life is like when you're young and you're in college or in your 20s, and then when you're older, you have all these responsibilities and stress. And the reality, again, in the general population, is somewhat different. That people actually tend to be happier in midlife and older, up to a point in life, where often they've kind of accomplished a lot of the things they want. They have more financial security, their kids are grown up, they have fewer responsibilities. So that's sort of a trend in the general population. That being said, in this group specifically, we absolutely saw lots of positive changes after 50, with people being less likely to be suicidal, less likely to be on medication for depression, more likely to have just positive experiences overall, personally and interpersonally. So there were a lot of positive things that we noted, and we go into some detail about that. Being more, in addition to what I mentioned, less likely to take medication, less likely to feel suicidal. People were also more likely to say that they celebrated their differences rather than trying to hide them. Most of us have sort of camouflaged or masked our differences, or learned to try to appear more neurotypical, whereas people after 50 are more likely to sort of accept themselves and say, hey, this is who I am, I'm fine with being different. More self-acceptance, more kind of turning outward and helping others, connecting to the autism community, having autistic friends, feeling like this is a part of my identity, I want to give back. It also suggests sort of moving further along these so-called 9 degrees of autism, to a different stage of development.
We've certainly come a long way in terms of support for autistic people, but I think especially for adults, we have a long way to go. So what do you see as supports that are critical, particularly for older autistic adults, those 50 and older, as we move forward?
Yeah, so it's a lot. There is so little for autistic adults, not just 50 and older. My son is almost 24, and there aren't really enough supports and services for young adults either. There's lots of services for school-age children, and then when they hit that sort of cliff, or wall, as some people like to call it, at 21, 22, and age out of services, there are not nearly enough services. Housing being a really big one, whether it's subsidized housing or housing where people can get supports to live independently, support groups. So I happen to be in New England, where the Asperger Autism Network is, lots of support groups through that organization. But I think, much of the rest of the country and the rest of the world lacks those support groups. And just kind of understanding in general, because again, we weren't really seen or understood for who we were when we were growing up. So we're still struggling to kind of be seen and understood as older adults.
Now, for those that want to learn more about and possibly purchase older autistic adults, in their own words, the lost generation, how would they go about doing so?
Well, I think if you Google older autistic adults and the first author, who's Wilma Wake, you'll find it pretty quickly. But you can order directly from the publisher. Their website is aapcautismbooks.com. That's aapcautismbooks.com. I think it used to stand for Asperger Autism Publishing Company, but I think it's just called AAPC. Autism Books now. So you can, if you go to their website, it has our latest arrivals. You'll see our book smack in the middle of the page. There's both a hard copy and an ebook. And if you forget all that, but you remember my name, you can reach out to me, and I can direct folks to it. And people can reach me at Eric, ERIC, at topcollegeconsultants.com. So those are a couple of ways.
Now, Eric, beyond being an author of this book, you had talked at the earlier about your work with college students. Why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I primarily high school students applying to college, and occasionally college students applying to grad school. And I work with students worldwide most of whom have learning differences or emotional challenges, the largest number being autism, and help them understand, if they're ready for college, what kind of supports they might need in college, what would be a good set of colleges for them to apply to, help them go through the process of the applications, the essays, finding scholarships, and so on. And because I'm really immersed in the autism world, I'm finding internships and scholarships and college readiness programs and all kinds of services really tailored to this group that most people don't know about. And, being autistic myself and being an autism parent, I really understand and connect with these students, feel very comfortable working with them, whereas a lot of people just don't really connect or don't quite know how to proceed with them.
Well, Eric, I thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Thanks so much to Eric for the conversation. To learn more about Eric's book, Older Autistic Adults, in their own words, The Lost Generation, and purchase it, check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. If you would like to learn beyond this podcast how Autism Personal Coach can help you to reduce your daily overwhelm and to get the things you want in your life, then book a Zoom call with me today. A link to book a call can be found in the podcast description of this episode. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. And we would also really appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On next week's episode of Autism Stories, we will have a conversation about being autistic and having dissociative identity disorder. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.